For those of you who are not normally here, I want to assure you I am not one of the preachers that you would normally see up here. So if you don't like what you hear, come back next week and you'll hear something different. We also have a strict policy against throwing things at the speaker, particularly while they're talking. So afterwards, you can take me outside and do whatever you need to do. This is kind of a special week for Dawn and I. This is our last regular week to be here with you at the Go Church. We came with the commitment to be here for a year. We thought, partway through the year, this would be a really great place to just stay. But we really feel a strong calling to go back to CCW. There's some challenges ahead as CCW prepares for its next church plant. And so we're going back there to be part of that. This has been a great year for us. We leave with great confidence in the potential that is in this place. We believe that there is a great spirit about the congregation here. We think you've got an awesome leadership, 2 great ministers, 2 great elders to provide direction. So how can it go wrong, What I was asked to do by the leadership today was talk a little bit about how we're doing here at the Go Church. Now, some of you may not know that the Go Church model, church planting model, is something that CCW developed over, it was better than a year, but a full year of planning, praying, process, development, and it's a reproducible church planting model. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, but this question of how we're doing, that's one of the questions they ask you when you get enough gray hair to people think you have an opinion that matters, But the answer to how we're doing really depends on what you mean by asking the question. So, Jesus was asked a lot of questions during his time in his ministry. One day, one of the leaders of the law asked him, well, what's the most important commandment? Now, this guy, he was, up teaching the law all the time. He was an authority on the law, and he asked Jesus what was the most important commandment. And Jesus' response we find in Mark 12, verses 30 and 31. He said that you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your mind. And the second is like it. Love the neighbor. You love your neighbor as yourself. He said, there is no commandment that is greater than these. So when asked what was most important, this is Jesus' response. What he didn't say, I think, is important. And sometimes the problems that we get into in following God is not really paying attention to what wasn't said. I'm getting signals that I need to do something different here. Is that better? Can you hear me now? If you can't hear me, wave your hand. I might actually say something important and you would miss it. That would be bad. So what he didn't say to us was you need to go to more Bible studies. What he didn't say was you need to do more service projects. What he didn't say was you need to give more money. What he didn't say was you need to go to church more often. Or that you need to follow the law better. Or you need to be a more righteous person. Or any of these things that he could have said. Now, I'm not saying that any of those things are not important. And he he talked about all those things, so they obviously had some importance. But when asked what was the most important, he said these things. And this is my interpretation of what he said. He said, you need to love God enough to do what he said to do and be what he meant you to be. So it's not about a fan club for God. It's not about being part of a social movement or a happy place where we get to do the things we want to do or think give us validity or value. It is about becoming a child and a servant of God and doing the things that he said to do and being the person that he called you to be. And then he said, you need to care enough about your neighbor's broken state that you do something about it. Well, that presumes a couple things. One is that you understand your neighbor is in a broken state. And I think we often walk through our lives with this delusion that everybody around us is okay. When Christ looked at the masses, he cried. He saw them as a sheep without a shepherd. He saw them as people that were going the wrong way. When asked about how many people were going to heaven, he said, only a few. He said the way to destruction is broad, and that most people are going that way. So when asked what was most important, he said, love the Lord your God enough to do what he said, to be what he meant you to be. Love your neighbor's broken situation enough that you're going to do something about it. Now, it recognizes you can't do everything about it, and for many of the broken people around you, you can't do anything. But if you're not putting in an effort to do something, then you're not following this command of God. He said that all of the law was wrapped up in these two commands, and there was no commandment that was greater. So we really probably are not going to find a better place to devote our attention to pleasing God, to being where he wants us to be, than this thing that Christ said here. So this was partway through his ministry. You know, after a while he got betrayed, he got hung on a cross, he went to the grave, he resurrected, and then he spent about 6 or 7 weeks on earth with his disciples after that time before he ascended. And he then said some final words. We place a lot of emphasis on final words. You know, people talk about what goes on your tombstone, your epitaph, how people are going to remember you. And many times it's about these last statements that people make. So when Christ said his final words, he called his disciples to him and he said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now think about that. That's a big deal. All authority has been given to me. So what's important to me? I want you to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I've taught you, and surely I will be with you always to the very end of the age. So what did he say here? He said that his people, his church, was to be a disciple-making machine, and each of us was to be a disciple maker. That was his intent. These were his final words. These don't displace this greatest commandment notion, because it actually is what that commandment says, that we need to be loving God enough to do what he's called us to do, and love our neighbors enough to do something about their broken state. The problem that we have as human beings is, particularly in our, well, not particularly, but as it relates to this subject, when we want to follow God, we usually find a way to do it in a way that is more comfortable for us. We choose a path that is easier, we perceive to be more attainable, more aligned with what we would think is important, instead of saying, God, what is it you want me to do? Where is it you want me to be? And then doing the things that he's called us to. The leadership of the CCW has been aware of this for years, and we've been working on changing the culture, the landscape of what the church is, because CCW has been as guilty as many other churches of hobby-horsing things that God did not tell us to focus on. They were good things, you know, service projects and more Bible studies and more events, but they were not the things that God called us to focus on. So we've been steadily working on that culture change, and the Go Church church planting model was part of that. One of the aims in the Go Church model was to kind of jumpstart small congregations with people who had some understanding of this issue and were willing to leave behind the traditional structures and the things that we get comfortable with and used to in a church, and go and do something meaningful and important in God's eyes. something meaningful and important in God's eyes. So having spent a year in this prayer and process to create a Spirit-led process for planting of churches, this church got planted. So this is the first one. Congratulations. And you're a year old now. So this brings us back to this question. So how are we doing? How are we doing? We understand what the task is. We even have go in our name. We even chose the Great Commission as our mission statement. What could go wrong? I mean, we've got it figured out here. You know, when I was asked to speak to this, I tend to, as I've gotten older, be a little less focused on how other people are doing, a little more focused on how I'm doing. So when asked, how are we doing, my inclination, rightly, is to say, how am I doing? And what I know about myself is that I have a tendency over the years, I've been a Christian now for 37 years, to get busy with other things that are of interest to me or things that might be really important in life but are not really about God's stuff. And so then I can run out of margin, any space for dealing with God's stuff. I can get distracted and just unintentional about this task that He's given me. This task that is not natural for me any more than it is natural for you, to go and make disciples of other people. So I guess what I would encourage you to do right now is think about how you're doing. If God said that you are to be part of a body of people that is a disciple-making machine, and that you are to be a disciple maker, and you want to love God and do the things that He's called you to do, then how are you doing? Because this is the task. It isn't to be here every Sunday morning. That's a good thing to do. It's not to be part of a mission group. Good thing to do. It's not to give a tithe. Good thing to do. These things are not the most important things. They're not the final words. So the most important things and the final words is where we want to devote our attention. So how would you say we're doing? How would you say that you're doing? If the church is to be a disciple-making machine, is the evidence that we're doing that job here? That's a rhetorical question. I'm not looking for you to answer it, and I'm not going to answer it for you either. What I will say is the church will succeed in its mission when you and I succeed in ours. This is not something about the leadership of the church, or the job of the ministers or the elders. The job of the ministers and the elders is to make sure that there's an environment that you can thrive in and grow spiritually and be about this business that God's called you to be about. So you've got that. I'm sure you've got that. The question then is, how am I doing in this task? One of the things that we encountered along the way as we considered how to become disciple-making people and disciple-making church was this group called Real Life Discipleship. And they had a model. You all, most of you have been exposed to it, saw the wheel, discipleship wheel, that talked about levels of maturity in being a disciple. Well, one of the things that the elders did along the way was we took this list of everybody that was in the church at CCW, and we went through, based on our knowledge of those people in their lives, tried to figure out who were the disciple makers, who were the spiritual parents, and who was at some other stage. And what we found was CCW was very heavily populated with spiritual young adults, and that we had relatively very few spiritual parents. So I'm going to just tell you what a spiritual young adult is, because you might find that this fits you pretty well. I know that I keep sliding back into this state myself. Regular in attendance, involved in ministry and service. That means I understand that I have a job to do as part of the church. developed healthy spiritual habits, regularly looking at the Bible, meditating on God's Word, maybe even involved in a discipling relationship at some level. By most measures, a spiritual young adult is a disciple of Christ that any church would be happy to have. Okay? I mean, most churches would love to have it because most churches are populated by people that are not even at this level. They're at some lesser level of spiritual development. So what is the difference between a spiritual young adult and a spiritual parent, which is what we need to be? Well, it's all of what I just said. So all those things are important to being a spiritual parent, but it is taking on a parental concern for the spiritual welfare of others. I think it is this that Christ was talking about when he said you need to love your neighbor as yourself. You need to care enough about the spiritual welfare of the people around you that you do something about it. Now that might be scary. You don't know what to do. You don't know what to say. But if you don't aim to do it, you'll never know what to do and you'll never know what to say because you won't have learned anything. So you got to move through the scariness. You got to step out in faith and you got to do what Christ called you to do. You've got to be the person that Christ called you to be. This distinction between being a spiritual young adult and a spiritual parent is not really about how long someone's been a Christian. So we've seen people who are very young in the faith, chronologically, who very quickly move to this place of being a spiritual parent. They understand the job and they are about it. Now they fumble a lot. They don't know how to answer questions, but they understand that their job is to make disciples. So they're out there doing it. And you know what happens? They grow really fast. They start learning how to answer the questions they couldn't answer. They start learning what to say. They start knowing what to do. And they're making a difference. We also see people who have been in the church for, well, I can't say centuries because I don't know any of those people, but for decades, who are not even spiritual young adults, much less spiritual parents. So it's not about how long you've been a Christian. You can be a gray-haired infant when it comes to spiritual matters. It is about understanding. It's about attitude. It's a choice we make, ownership of this task, responsibility that as a child of God, as a soldier in God's army, that this is what God has saved me for. I know what he saved me from, but this is what he saved me for. It isn't to do good works generically. Okay, so if I go and do good works, but I don't do them in a way that people identify me as a disciple of Christ doing good works, then my good works are nice humanitarian gestures, but that's not what God called me to be. He didn't call me to be a moral judge for the world and its behavior, or even to try and fix in my local environment the moral behavior of the people around me. I frequently hear Christians say, well, you know, in my workplace they've come to know that I'm a Christian, now they don't cuss around me anymore. Like that's an accomplishment. Actually, you know, if they did that out of respect for you, that's fine. If they did that because you suggested they shouldn't be cussing around you, that's a real problem because that is the moral high ground. And that's a judgment that we receive by the world around us. They might care enough to not offend you, but the fact that you're offended by their behavior when they're non-Christians has no point. You weren't called to be offended by the behavior of non-Christians. We were called to be possibly offended and bothered by the behavior of Christians. We have some responsibility there, but for the world around us, that ain't our job. Our job is to be a light, a source of redemption, the pathway of redemption for people. So we need to be an attractive force to the world around us. So where are you in this? Are you a spiritual young adult? And if you are, but you're not a spiritual parent, why? If you're not a spiritual young adult, bigger why? You need to, these are just behaviors and things that we need to be doing as Christians. But really, you can aim for the right spot, which is to be a spiritual parent from the start. And it's not a bad thing to do. Now, I don't know about you, when I start thinking about what God's called me to do, and I start being real with myself about where I'm spending my time and what I'm doing, I often come up short. And I start feeling pretty convicted about my inadequacy in the task that God's given me to do. That's been a recurrent theme in my life. So don't think that because I'm an elder in the church, I've got all this figured out, and that my days don't have the same challenges that your days have got. But what I do know is that when I come up short on what God's called me to do, there's one response that is a bad response, and that is to feel guilty about it. Okay, so if you're feeling convicted, that's a sign from the Spirit that it's time to do something. What it's not time to do is to just feel guilty, because guilt is paralyzing. Guilt is Satan's tool for keeping you right where you're at and doing nothing. Satan says, yeah, I told you couldn't do this. I told you weren't good enough to be a child of God. And now, here's the evidence. Well, yeah, I'm the evidence every day that I'm not good enough to be a child of God and that I'm inadequate for the task that God's given me. But I'm not listening to that message from Satan. What I am listening to is the message from God that He's given me what I need to do this. And I've just got to realign myself, get back to it. So I want to share for a minute what I have found to be helpful in my life recurrently as I have confronted this and recognized that I slide back into doing what's comfortable for me, doing what doesn't ultimately matter in the spiritual lives of other people, and therefore doesn't matter for eternity. Instead, margin. Some of our lives are just too busy to have any room for God's stuff. And if that's you, you're the only person that can fix that. You've got to have space for God's stuff. I've got a friend who I think is more intentional about this process of discipleship than anybody I know. He drives a truck for a living, so he's away from home 5 full days a week. I mean, he's not home on evenings, so he's gone from Monday morning to Friday evening. And can, during that time, do very little in the way of making a difference in the lives around him, at least to where he lives. I'm sure there's some lives he's impacting elsewhere. He will do some over-the-phone discipleship stuff, but he really believes that 10% of his time belongs to God as much as 10% of his money. So when he's home on the weekend, most of Saturday is spent in discipling relationships. He's very intentional about it. I mean, maybe more mechanical than you would like. He schedules people into slots, and people show up, and he's also very purposeful about where they are in their spiritual growth and what they need to be doing next, and communicating that to them. You know, you could be critical of that, but what he's doing is within the construct of how he understands to do this. He's doing something, and he's made more of a difference because of it than most people that I know. And he's not a minister, and he's not an elder. So it's important that we have space, that we make margin. It's never going to be comfortable to cut the things out of your life that you want to do, or that you think your family needs, or that your children need. But, and I'm not saying neglect your family or children. I'm saying that you can't be so focused on your family and children that you are not focused on God. That's an imbalance that we often suffer from, and we need to get over. We need to be intentional. This stuff that God's called us to is not going to happen by accident. It's going to happen because we choose to do it. The guy I just described to you, he's intentional. He's very deliberate about doing it. He's got his time set aside for it. He knows what he's going to do in that time. And he's got a process for getting into relationships and moving those relationships down the road. Also terminating those relationships, at least in terms of discipleship, when they're not going anywhere, so that he can spend time with someone that is interested in moving forward. So intentionality is important. Understanding what it is that we've received. I talked about we know what we've been saved from. Well, I actually talked to a number of Christians that I'm not so sure they understand what they were saved from. I mean, if you think you were a pretty good person before you became a Christian, you don't see yourself as God saw you. In order to really understand what you're saved from, you need to see yourself as God saw you. You weren't a pretty good person. You needed badly the blood of Christ, just like I needed badly the blood of Christ. I need to understand what I was saved from in order to grasp a hold of what I was saved for. It's a motivational thing. As I look back, and it makes me appreciate and love God all the more for what He's done for me, as I understand how He saw me before He shed His Son's blood for me. Don't settle for doing something less. Don't find something that you enjoy doing in the church and then distract yourself with that so that you don't do what you were called to do. Make sure that the most important stays the most important. There are plenty of things that we need to be doing that are less important, but don't lose balance and don't settle for something less than what God called you to. If you don't know how to do all this, then you go find a mentor. You look around, you find somebody that seems to be doing a bit better than you. Go say, hey, can we get together once a week? And you show me how to move down this path. That's called discipleship. Find a mentor. And if you know how to do it, but you find yourself preoccupied with other things, not doing what you need to do, then you need to find some accountability. Somebody that understands where you're at and can poke you. Ask you how you're doing. How are you doing with your ponds and their development, which is a tool that we've provided for thinking about the relationships around you. How are you doing in this discipling relationship? Where is it going? What's the evidence that the person's actually growing? There's a lot of issues in accountability. So coming back to this question, how we're doing, what I do believe is that opportunity abounds. The world around us is lost. It's hurting, it's sick, it needs some help. So there's plenty of opportunity out there. You all, as a church, have been blessed with more than most young churches get blessed with. You've got two awesome ministers. You hear great messages all the time. You've got two elders that are lovers of God, committed to doing what needs to be done to protect and foster the growth of this church. You don't have financial problems. You don't have strife and divisions within the church. You've got everything you need to move forward. But it's not about showing up here on Sunday morning. So we haven't arrived. Okay, there's my final answer on how we're doing. We have not arrived. But I'm pretty sure that there is never any point in history of this church or any other that I could say that we have arrived. Just like I can't say in my spiritual life that I have arrived at any point. So there's room to grow for all of us and for this church to grow and get more focused on this purpose. We're getting ready to plant another church. So you all are going to be the big sister of another church. This church will be planting another church by 2020. So you're going to be a big sister and a mother to another church. There's going to need to be a lot more people here to make that happen. There's going to have to be some leadership development in order to make that happen. It's going to happen because you and I, and we as a church, get intentional about what God's called us to. We love God enough to do what He's called us to do. We love God enough to be what He's called us to be. And we love our neighbors enough to do something about their broken state. We're in a good place. We're off to a good start, but we've got some space to go. Each of us can still contribute to the win. So there's always opportunity to become part of the solution instead of part of the problem. So, and it's important to remember that the people that exist in your life that are not in mine, you might be the only lifeline they've got for how to get connected to God. That's a really important responsibility for each one of us. So don't assume that someone else is going to do what needs to be done or say what needs to be said. You need to assume that you are the only solution for that person's situation, that you are the person who's been put there by God to make a difference. Would you pray with me, please? God, we do love you and thank you so much for your love for us as we understand more of who we are and who you are. It's all the more amazing that you could care enough about us to make the enormous sacrifice that you made for our sakes, particularly in the state we were and the disregard we had for you and your things at that time. Help us, God, to not be people that have a disregard for who you are and what you want now. Help us to be people that understand what we've been saved from so that we can do the task that we've been saved for. Help us to, as individuals, as mission groups, as a church, be a dynamic force being driven by your Spirit, accomplishing the work of your kingdom and making a difference, eternal difference in the lives of those that we come in contact with. And just making it so that you can, with great joy on that day, say, well done, good and faithful servant. For that is what we are. We are your servants, seeking to do your will. It's in your Son's name I pray. Amen.
Please stand before you